At 0640 a.m. on January 21, 1945, Seaman First Class James H. Marlowe knelt beside a thin metal seam on the forward flight deck of USS Ticonderoga. The wind cut across the bow, carrying the sharp smell of avgas and cold salt. Marlowe pressed his palm to the steel and felt a faint tremble each time a Hellcat rolled over the line of rivets behind him. Morning light drifted across the deck in slow bands, revealing the uneven shimmer of the plating he had been worrying about for days. He leaned close, breath fogging against the chilled surface, and scraped away a line of sea crust with the tip of his glove. The seam flexed so slightly that no officer would ever notice, a tiny pulse of metal answering the weight of aircraft and the shifting heartbeat of the ship below. Marlowe glanced toward the island tower. No one was watching. He brushed the grit from his thumb and stayed there for a moment, listening to the low hum of machinery rising from the hangar. Far out on the gray horizon, a thin black speck turned toward the carrier group. Marlowe did not see it. He did not know that before this day ended, the seam beneath his hand would be the only thing between Ticonderoga and fire. James H. Marlowe had joined the Navy 2 years earlier with the simple hope of earning a trade. Back home in Ohio, welding meant steady work and a quiet life, not the roar of engines or the sting of metal dust in the lungs. He had grown up watching his father fix tractors with a calm patience that seemed unbreakable. Marlowe wanted that same steadiness. The uniform, the discipline, the promise of learning a craft that mattered, all of it pulled him toward the service long before the recruiters did. At Great Lakes, instructors drilled into the men a creed as old as the fleet. Strong steel saves weak flesh. Perfect seams save imperfect days. A welder was never to rush, never to approximate, never to trust a joint that felt wrong. Marlowe carried those rules like weight in his pocket. Every lesson told him that precision was survival. A carrier like Ticonderoga was a world of moving metal. The frame expanded in heat and tightened in cold. Engines shook the ribs of the ship like distant thunder. Aircraft clawed at the deck with wheels that struck harder than most men ever imagined. The flight deck was the breathing skin of the vessel. It flexed under each landing, held firm under each launch, and bore the scars of every hour spent in the Pacific. The crew believed in the strength of that steel. They believed in its capacity to endure bombs, fire, and the sudden violence of impact. They believed that as long as every rivet and weld stayed true, the ship would keep them alive. That faith was quiet, unspoken, passed from man to man the way sailors share luck or superstition. Marlowe admired the machine around him. The elevators carrying aircraft between decks. The arresting wires humming like living cables. The heat radiating from the boilers deep below. It all worked because thousands of small hands shaped it and tended it. In the Navy, a single mistake in metal could ripple across the whole ship. A half-inch gap might become a crack. A crack might become a tear. A tear might become the last thing anyone ever saw. He wanted to be one of the men who kept the seams from failing. He wanted to believe the ship was as invincible as everyone said. But out on the Pacific, far from the textbooks and workshop benches of training, Ticonderoga had begun to whisper a different truth. The steel breathed harder each week. The deck vibrated longer after landings. Something in the great machine felt tired. And machines that grow tired also grow vulnerable. The first signs were small enough to ignore. A faint click underfoot during a cold sunrise. A shudder in the deck after an especially heavy landing. A hairline mark that appeared one morning near the forward catwalk and seemed a little longer the next afternoon. Most men walked past these things without noticing. The Pacific was rough, the work was rougher, and ships lived hard lives out here. Steel groaned. Rivets sang. Plates shifted. That was normal. But to a welder, the tiny sounds were not noise. They were warnings. Marlowe began to feel the difference during night operations. When the ship launched aircraft in rapid cycles, vibrations traveled through the deck in long waves. The steel should have settled quickly once the planes were airborne. Instead, the tremor lingered, as if the deck needed an extra heartbeat to remember its shape. On one moonless night, after a Hellcat caught an arresting wire at a slight angle, Marlowe felt the plating beneath him twitch in a way he had never felt before. It reminded him of a loose hinge in his father's barn door, the kind that moved half an inch farther every time the wind pushed it. Then came the accidents, small ones at first. A plane captain stumbled when his boot wedged into a narrow gap between two plates that had been tight only a week earlier. A deck crewman rolling a trolley of ammunition felt the wheels dip, just for a second, into a seam that should not have existed. Both men shook it off. The officers wrote the incidents down as routine hazards of carrier work. But Marlowe knew the surface was changing. A report circulated after a minor landing mishap. A fighter had skidded farther than expected, its tailhook catching late because the deck slope near the forward zone had grown subtly uneven. The official notes ended with a phrase the welders had come to resent. Within acceptable tolerance. Another line followed. No repair required at this time. For Marlowe, those words were heavier than a reprimand. They meant the ship believed its own perfection. They meant no one was listening to the steel. As the days passed, he traced the same seam near the bow with the side of his boot each morning, feeling the metal respond with a soft, reluctant shift. The crew moved over it without a thought. The officers trusted the reports. Yet the seam continued to widen, almost imperceptibly, like a breath held too long. If the deck was truly as strong as the manuals claimed, why were the gaps spreading? Why were the tremors lasting longer? Why were men stumbling on a surface that was supposed to be flawless? If the system was right, why did the ship feel wrong? Marlowe first understood the danger during a quiet hour before dawn. The deck was empty except for a few scattered tools and the lingering warmth of engines that had shut down in the dark. He walked toward the forward seam, letting his fingertips drift along the chilled surface. The metal felt restless, like something alive and uneasy beneath a thin skin. He pressed harder. The plate flexed just enough to betray the truth. The structure was weakening. According to the manual, welders were to report irregularities, wait for an officer, and repair only after official inspection. According to the pace of combat, such inspections often took days. According to Marlowe's instincts, the deck did not have days left. He had watched too many landings slam against that section. He had seen too many men stumble near it. Now, alone in the half-light, he crouched and studied the thin line where two plates met. Salt crystallized along the edges. The surface carried the faint ripple of repeated stress. Every lesson he had learned told him this joint was no longer safe. He went to the tool locker without asking permission. He retrieved a torch, a spool of reinforcing wire, a chisel, and a narrow wedge of spare steel meant for emergency use only. The rules said he needed an officer's signature to take any of it. The rules also said the deck was within tolerance. He returned to the seam, set his torch, and waited for the flame to steady into a controlled blue. The heat licked against the cold plate, spreading a thin whisper of steam into the air. Marlowe cut open the existing weld with slow, deliberate passes. The metal resisted at first, then surrendered with a soft crack that only someone who knew steel could hear. Beneath the seam, the truth revealed itself. The underplate had warped just enough to begin peeling away from its support. A few more landings, and the deck could have split along that line. Not catastrophically at first, but just enough to throw a landing fighter off balance, or to let burning fuel spill into the lower compartments. Marlowe slid the reinforcing plate beneath the gap. It was slightly thicker than regulations allowed. He tapped it into place with the side of his fist, feeling it settle with a final, certain weight. Then he began the weld. The torch hissed. Sparks traced small arcs around his boots. Heat rose into his face, turning beads of sweat into tiny burning trails. His gloves stiffened with the effort. The smell of scorched salt and old paint drifted up as he worked a new seam into existence, layer by careful layer. If an officer appeared now, he would face reprimand. If a supervisor asked why he was changing a structure that needed no repair, he would have no answer except the one he trusted most. The steel felt wrong. When he finished, the seam gleamed faintly, thicker, stronger, a quiet defiance hidden beneath the morning haze. He wiped the metal with his glove and stood slowly, his back stiff from the cold. No one saw him break protocol. No one heard the whisper of the plate settling into its new shape. But the deck felt different under his weight. Solid. Ready. Marlowe walked away without looking back. He had risked his record, his standing, and perhaps his place on the crew. He had done it for one simple reason. He wanted the next man who stepped on that seam to live. The warning came just after midday. A thin call over the radio net. Bogies inbound from the north. Altitude unknown. Speed increasing. The flight deck crew froze for a heartbeat, then scattered into practiced positions. Planes were fueled. Others were armed. Some sat with engines idling at the edge of the deck, waiting for clearance to launch. Marlowe was beneath the island tower when the klaxon wailed. He felt the vibration through the soles of his boots before he understood the meaning. This was not a distant threat. This was the kind that reached across the horizon in minutes. The kind that moved too fast for comfort or calculation. Ticonderoga turned into the wind. The deck shifted under Marlowe's feet, rising and falling with the ocean swell. Sailors shouted. Ordnance crews rolled carts toward the aft lift. Plane handlers waved frantic signals as aircraft inched forward. Everything on the deck became noise and motion, a living machine trying to prepare itself for a blow it could not fully see. Marlowe glanced toward the bow. The seam he had reinforced lay somewhere beneath the feet of the men guiding a Hellcat toward the catapult. For a brief moment, he felt a cold line of doubt cut through him. He had changed the ship without permission. He had placed his trust in instinct. If he had misjudged the metal, if the reinforcement warped under heat, if the weld failed during strain, the deck could buckle at the worst possible moment. The radio crackled again. Enemy aircraft diving. The word that followed was quiet, almost swallowed by static. Kamikaze. On the horizon, a dark speck dropped from the clouds. The crew recognized the shape instantly. A Zero with clipped wings, engine screaming as it plunged toward the carrier group. The sound of its dive reached the ship as a thin, rising howl. The Hellcats on deck could not launch in time. The fighters already airborne were too far out. Anti-aircraft crews opened fire. Tracers arced upward, streaking past the descending silhouette. Shell bursts dotted the sky, but the Zero kept coming, alive with the terrible certainty of a pilot who did not intend to return. The aircraft veered lower, skimming the edge of the formation. Then it straightened, aligning itself with Ticonderoga's forward deck. Marlowe felt the breath leave his lungs. The Zero struck the deck in a flower of fire and smoke. The explosion rolled across the bow, blasting shrapnel and burning fuel outward in a wide arc. Men nearest the impact were thrown off their feet. Tools clattered across steel. A shockwave hit Marlowe like a hammer, driving him backward as the entire ship shuddered. For a moment, everything was sound. A rising roar of flame. A metallic groan from the forward structure. A wave of panicked voices calling out through thick smoke. Then, through the haze, the truth emerged. The bow was damaged, but still intact. The plating had bent inward, but had not torn. The impact had struck almost precisely at the reinforced seam. The extra steel Marlowe had wedged into place now bore the brunt of the destruction. It absorbed the energy like a hidden rib, taking the violence into itself rather than letting it travel deep into the ship. If the seam had failed, burning fuel would have poured into the compartments below. Dozens of men would have been trapped. Fire could have spread backward to the armed aircraft waiting for launch. The ship might have lost her forward deck entirely. Instead, smoke lifted slowly over a wound that had not gone through. Sailors crawled to their feet. Others dragged hoses toward the flames. The deck, though cracked and scorched, still held beneath them. Marlowe felt the vibration again, but this time it was steady. The reinforced plate had not moved. It had done exactly what he hoped it would do on the morning he broke the rules. It had kept the ship alive. When the fire teams finally smothered the last pockets of flame, the forward deck sagged under a haze of smoke and heat. Burnt paint curled along the metal like charred leaves. Fragments of the Zero lay scattered in warped shapes that barely resembled an aircraft. The men moved slowly now, stunned by the violence that had passed only minutes earlier. Marlowe stood among them, breathing through a cloth pressed to his mouth. His gloves were black with soot. His ears rang from the blast. A strip of metal had sliced across his left forearm when the shockwave hit, leaving a thin line of blood that soaked into his sleeve. He barely felt it. His eyes were fixed on the seam. The reinforcement held. The steel was bruised but unbroken, the weld line visible beneath a layer of scorched grit. The structure around it bent inward in a shallow curve, the way a shield bends when struck too hard. Fire had eaten across the surface, yet the plate had refused to tear open. Officers inspected the damage with quick, tense glances. They spoke in clipped phrases. Forward deck compromised. Structural deformation. Repair teams assemble. No one asked why the joint had taken the impact better than expected. No one wondered aloud why that section had not collapsed under the force. In the noise and urgency of battle damage control, there was no space for questions. Marlowe knew this was his moment to speak. He could have stepped forward, explained the thicker plate, the unauthorized weld, the instinct that had driven him to act before anyone else believed there was a problem. But as he watched the officers move on, he felt the weight of the ship's culture settle over him. Admitting what he had done meant accepting the penalty. Breaking procedure was an offense, even if it had saved lives. A petty officer passed him and paused. He stared at the blackened seam for a long second, brow furrowing with a faint, puzzled curiosity. Then he turned away without a word. The official damage report would later describe the area as structurally stressed but serviceable. No reference to reinforcement. No mention of the man who had altered the deck. That night, after the wounded were taken below and the fires finally died, Marlowe sat alone beside a coil of cable. His arm throbbed. His uniform smelled of smoke and oil. In his pocket lay a folded letter from his sister, written weeks earlier, telling him to stay safe and come home soon. He looked at the battered deck stretching into the dark Pacific night. No one would know what he had done. No one would ever ask. The ship sailed on in silence. In the weeks after the attack, Ticonderoga limped through repairs with the calm efficiency of a ship that had already survived too much. Engineers studied the damaged bow, measuring the bend of the plates and the unusual way the force had dispersed across the forward structure. They noted that the impact pattern did not match the predicted failure model. The seam should have torn open. Instead, it had absorbed the blow and folded inward like a hinge built to take punishment. One senior engineer marked the reinforced area with a small chalk circle. He wrote a few notes in his logbook, all in technical shorthand. Additional plating recommended. Stress distribution unexpectedly favorable. Review potential for future design. It was the closest anyone came to understanding what Marlowe had done. A month later, a quiet directive circulated through the repair ships. Bow seams on several carriers were to be strengthened with a slightly thicker plate and a double weld pass. No explanation accompanied the change. No name appeared beside the recommendation. It was simply added to the evolving knowledge of how to keep a carrier alive in a war that punished even the smallest weakness. Marlowe never heard about the new standard. After the ship returned stateside, he finished his service and went home to Ohio. He found work in a garage, welding tractor frames and fixing old plows with the same patience his father once showed him. He rarely spoke of the Navy. When he did, he mentioned storms, the noise of aircraft, and the strange way metal could remember every hand that shaped it. He never mentioned the seam. Years later, long after the Pacific battles had faded into textbooks and ceremonies, a historian studying carrier damage patterns paused at one photograph. A reinforced line on Ticonderoga's forward deck. The weld was rougher than standard. Thicker. Different. He traced it with a fingertip and wondered who had placed it there. On the surface of a ship that survived what should have killed her, one truth remained. Sometimes a small hand and a single choice can hold back fire.